Now, you mentioned about this. Is it a whoop of Gibbons or a flange of Gibbons?
I think since not the 9 o'clock news, it's been a flange, hasn't it?
So. Yeah, I remember that sketch. Okay, Gerald, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yes.
So
he's livid.
So you've got this group of Gibbons, right? And they've got all these implants in their head, and this guy's probably sitting there with some great big control panel, saying, "I'm going to make that one fall asleep. I'm going to make that one attack that one.
You've got to
do
think
this."
of it like this. Have you seen that computer program, The Sims?
Oh yeah, The
It's
Sims.
basically like that, and we've got real live pieces.
Now, okay, I don't dispute that project probably happened now, but how would that guy get permission? Because bearing in mind that we're supposed to live in a civilized society where we've got, you know, there's meant to be people keeping check on things that are done with moral codes, etc. Would that have been done in secret when it was done?
No, not at all. No, he was sponsored by Yale University.
Yale University.
Yeah, and in 1967, well, he worked at Yale. In 1967, Yale University released their own internal report, and this was called Man's Intervention into Intercerebral Functions. And this is coming from a university. Techniques are being developed for the investigation and manipulation of man. Two-way communication with the depth of the brain makes it possible to send and receive information to and from the brain. We can start, stop or modify a variety of automatic, somatic, behavioural and mental manifestations. We can experiment with intercerebral mechanisms responsible for the onset and maintenance of specific behavioural and mental functions. As no batteries are used, the life of this transmitter is indefinite. Power information are supplied by radio frequencies. So this is coming from one of the most prestigious universities in America, releasing a report at the time that they're doing these experiments to tell people the point of this is to control the functions of man. Yeah.
So you said power and information there, Neil. Did you say power and information?
Yeah, essentially, basically, it receives all its... you don't need like an external hard drive or anything. The chips, electrodes, whatever you want to call them, through the radio waves receive the power and they receive all the program.
Right. Is it not powered through something in the brain or the body?
Some of it...
I can't see how you would power something through
Well,
a
I assume
wave.
that they're going to use the natural electric stimulation in the brain to
so
sort of...
they don't run out. They don't need a battery.
They never run out, and this was in 1967.
Right. Okay. Now,
the connections in DARPA, as I say, basically, Delgado said that in the future, soldiers would be, run by generals by basically electronic stimulation. Well, in 2010, DARPA, basically, which is the American Defense
Research Establishment.
Yeah. And a guy called William J. Tyler, Dr. William J. Tyler, started investigating deep brain stimulation and transmagnetic cranial stimulation. Okay. Now, remember we talked about the God helmet, which is essentially a load of magnets around your head, and it's a weak sort of magnetic field that can affect your brain functions. Now, this is being introduced into soldiers' helmets, American soldiers' helmets, transcranial magnetic stimulation. The point of this and the effects that it actually has are shocking and incredible. What it can do is it can basically reduce fatigue, it can lift morale, it can get rid of pain. Basically, what you can do is you can turn these soldiers into super soldiers with higher mental functions. Apparently, it can turn you into sort of like an idiot savant as well, like a sort of Rain Man figure, and reduce the sort of tension of battle to near to nothing. So essentially, you can make all these high-powered. You could be there gunning away and working out algorithms at the same time because of the power that comes through these helmets.
And you said it removes the conscience as
well. This is another thing. This is the DARPA project, but also at Harvard at the same time. I believe it's a gentleman called Pittman. What they're actually doing is they're experimenting with both transcranial magnetic stimulation, but also the use of drugs, and obviously we know that drugs are useful in mind control. What this does is it basically, memory-altering drugs could mean that violent combat becomes no more troubling to a soldier than a visit to the gym. So what this is doing is they're using transcranial magnetic stimulation and a series of drugs to remove guilt and harmful memories from soldiers. So you're going to have these soldiers that feel no pain, that can go for hours and hours and hours just by pressing the button, that can, work out 1,000,001 complicated things in the space of a second, have no conscience, and can have these memories wiped from their brain. Right. The problem with this is that if you know anything about the brain, post-traumatic stress disorder, essentially this is being sold as like a therapeutic way to prevent post-traumatic stress disorder. Yeah. The thing is that's a function of the brain to protect yourself from reliving trauma. Your brain is trying to defend yourself. So if you don't work through those emotions properly, if you bypass that, the danger that I see is that essentially you could be sending these people home pathological.
Right.
And the other thing is, when do you turn it back on? When do you turn your conscience back on? Do we really want robotic killing machines?
Now, you mentioned Robert Heath
Yes.
and James Olds. They implanted electrodes into pleasure centres of rats.
Well, that was James Olds. Robert Heath was the fellow that was mentioned in the BBC documentary. That was he was trying to cure homosexuality by putting a load of implants into similar to Delgado. Where Delgado was flip the boy's sexual orientation.
Right.
He was trying to use this as a cure.
Right.
So there was a guy. His code name was B19 in this experiment, and the results of this experiment were actually were released in the 70s, 72. But I think it actually took place in the 60s. He put something like 125 electrodes into this person's brain and kept sort of trying to.
Would these be radio controlled ones or wired in? Or?
I don't think they were wired. I think they were separate.
Okay. So you wouldn't be able to see any outside. They've got 20 odd implants in
125
the head. 125 tiny little
electrodes, basically.
Right. And you used a different word before the breaks.
The stime receivers were Delgado's particular design.
So he's got 125 devices in his head that are receiving signals, making them do all kinds of things. Well, tell us what happened there.
Well, in the end of the experiment, what they did was they hooked him up directly to his pleasure centres. So what you could do is essentially by pressing this button, you'd stimulate your pleasure centre, and it would put him into sort of akin to an orgasmic state, like a sort of high euphoric state. And the problem was that essentially after about 3 hours, they had to physically wrench this guy off the programme because he just decided... Within 3 hours, he pressed his button 1,500 times, leaving himself in a state of almost complete euphoria.
You know what I'm going to say now is the Woody Allen film called Sleeper, where it has this machine called the Orgasmatron, where it goes in and it gives them like multiple orgasms.
Well, the thing is...
But there's another bit in that film where they have the orb.
Yeah.
Have you seen that?
I've seen it.
He's disguised as a robot, and all of these sort of hippies are handing this thing around, they're giving them a high, and he won't let go of it. It's absolutely hilarious.
Well,
anyway,
it's interesting you say that because basically this was based on an experiment that previously was done on rats by a chap called James Olds, and essentially what he'd done is given these rats the opportunity to press this button, which would stimulate. So the
rat could stimulate this thing itself.
Yeah.
Or pressing a button with his nose or something. Or
exactly
this
like
paw
that.
or something.
Yeah, and what he found was basically every single one of these rats dehydrated or starved themselves to death because of a fixation on self-abuse, which is a stark warning for teenagers everywhere, I feel.
Oh, come on, Neil. Where's the proof of this? This is a rat, like, orgasmic itself to death.
Hey, this is released.
Well, this is released.
Yeah,
Is this disinformation or is it real? What do you think?
No, absolutely. This is a real thing.
Right.
This allowed for the funding to try it on humans.
Right. All right. So when will they be available in the shops?
I don't know. I keep writing to you then, but.
Right. Okay. Let's get back to the serious stuff.
Well, another type of implant was the tooth implant, essentially.
Right.
I mean, this is. All it was like a radio transmitter and receiver, and what it would do is it's like a microphone here, so a voice would come through and essentially...
It would be underneath your cap?
Yeah, it's so small that it could go under the cap of a molar or whatever. And basically it sounds like the voice is coming from directly inside your head. And now this was invented by a bloke called Dr. Andrea Puharich, and essentially the CIA bought this off him. They bought the patent and made sure that nobody else in the world could actually use this, and they bought this in 1987. And Dr. Puharich said, "We're able to develop a hearing device that fits under the cap of the tooth, and we could hear very clearly from a small relay and receiver and transmitter. And unfortunately, it was promptly classified by an agency of our government, CIA, but we did solve the problem in terms of hardware." Now, one of the people that you may have heard talk about this was Lucille Ball. She's an actress from the 40s, 50s in Hollywood. I Love Lucy was the very famous show that she was in. She claimed to be able that she was receiving radio signals from this thing, and essentially shortly after she went for some dental treatment, she started hearing what sounded like Japanese people speaking, and she was hearing it in her head, particularly when she went down, I think it was Coldwater Canyon, which is in Hollywood. She did this a few times and got sort of a bit freaked out by this, and so decided, because it was during the war, to report this. This is strange, I don't know what's going on. And actually, well, apparently, according to the legend, they found a spy ring, a Japanese spy ring that was operating out of a sort of stately home that was nearby, and people were arrested, and it was a genuine espionage plot. I mean, whether this is, you know, it's one of those legends of Hollywood. She claims it's true.
Right. I have heard of people claiming to pick up like Radio 2 in a filling or something.
Yeah. I think there was a famous baseball player as well who said that basically he was picking up the CIA were talking to him through his teeth. But basically, the point is, it's possible. Not only is it possible, but they definitely own it.
So if they've implanted someone with 125 implants, all in different parts of the brain that can stimulate different things,
yeah.
I mean, does each implant only just stimulate or not stimulate, or can they do different things with that? I
think as they've developed, you'd be surprised. I've heard now, I mean, this is actually it's not used for mind control techniques, but there is a chip that is used in medical reasons, that it's a crystalline chip. You inject somebody in the bloodstream and it finds its way to the brain and implants itself in the correct area of the brain to therefore cause the response. As to how they physically work nowadays...
How can they get it to go to the right part of the brain?
Through the bloodstream.
So it must have some kind of navigation, because it would just randomly go up, the wrong artery or whatever, wouldn't it?
This has been used in sort of things like, I don't know whether you've seen recent experiments where they've implanted chips into the brains of chimpanzees, and by basically thought action, these chimpanzees are able to move robotic arms that are on the other side of the room. So the technology now, and this is an available technology, so if we're talking about sort of physical prods, electrical prods in the 50s and 60s, who knows? I mean, one of the things that we talk about is essentially what's called your EEG, or electrosonograph, which is like a reading that your brain gives out before each task. If you can recreate that, then essentially you're just causing a natural function in the brain. So the suggestion is, certainly a lot of the weaponry uses that sort of thing, but the suggestion is that perhaps some of these chips have advanced to the point now where they can do that. So essentially, you know, if you're seeing a woman being beaten up in the street, or any response like that Marine that throws that dog off a cliff in Iraq or whatever, regardless of whether you care about it, you can be the biggest badass in the world and I don't care. Your brain will have an emotive response. Okay, that response cannot be stopped, or you know, there is a firing mechanism that works within your brain, and that's the same for every function, action, desire, emotion, whatever. If we can recreate that, we can cause that action. And there's no way that can stop it.
Now, what about the location of some of these devices, Neil? I've heard that the optic nerve is possibly used. Is that...
Well, I mean, one of the things that Delgado talked about was the fact that basically, again, this is as early as the late 50s, early 60s, mid-60s, sorry, that you can actually start to figure out what people, by receiving the messages back from the chip, you can start to figure out intentions and visual stimulation. So I would imagine nowadays we can have chips that can be put in the optical nerve and give a relay back.
Right. So, and possibly other parts of the brain as well, the frontal lobe and etc. So they're feeding back information so that someone could be sitting remotely monitoring that person with an idea of what that person's thinking.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
And then can perhaps send out stimuli to then make that person do something or think something or feel something.
I mean, they'll get it down to such a sort of honed technique, whereas like any response will be seen by a message. You know, like in the Matrix where the bloke says, "Oh, I don't see codes anymore. I see this guy, woman, bloke, that." You'll get to the point where this shape means this action, this shape means this action, and so we can counter that straight away. You may even have systems set up whereby if they start to feel particularly happy, make sure they don't, or, you know.
Right, so in other words, they've got some computer system which is interpreting the radio signals coming off and then making that into some visual thing that an operator can look at and completely know, well, not maybe completely know, but have information about what that person's state of mind is.
Since the 60s.
Right, now I've heard rumours that the NSA were fitting people in vulnerable categories in society with their experimental implants, and they were fitting them to lots of people. I mean, there's an article here by Dr. Rauni Kilde, who was the chief medical officer of Finland, and I'll read some of this out after the break. But she's claiming that all of these vulnerable people, like, well, I think it was
homeless people, alcoholics, people from mental institutions, military prisoners is a good one. Like, essentially people that that on the face of it
aren't going to cause a problem, perhaps.
Well, you can immediately plausibly deny it. You say, well, of course he says that. He's a mentalist. He's an old wino. Like,
Right.
you know, why on earth would you give any credence to what he
Right.
says? So,
okay. So, I mean, is there any indication as to how many people? Do you think it's the NSA that have been doing this, or do you think it's been done in this country, or what do you think the extent of people being fitted with? And is it all just experimental? I know these are difficult questions.
Well, the thing is, I mean, it's really speculative because, I mean, one of the things is that, to be quite honest, like NSA, CIA, FBI, of course they've got different delineations, but I get the distinct impression that there's a cross-channeling of information. A lot of the initial pre-MK Ultra stuff, it's all done through the Navy, like Chatter was done through the Navy, Delgado's sponsored to the Office of Naval Research and stuff like that. So I think these separations are just ways of taking off the mark. As to how many have been used, nobody would really know. I mean, that is essentially that is the biggest downfall, but also the cleverest way of maintaining secrecy, because you can't turn around and say 1,000 people were done on this. You can look at, say, the people that were used by William Sargent in St Thomas's, or Cameron in Montreal,
right.
or any number of people that have released experimental results and stuff
right.
like that. But it's clandestine,
right.
and it's clandestine for a reason.
Yeah. Now, Rowney Kilder claims that the devices are communicating via satellites, which are in turn controlled by ground computers. So
yeah.
there's a control center somewhere, presumably at a military base somewhere, that's using satellites to then two-way communicate with their mind-controlled people with psychotronic devices.
Yeah.
So presumably there's secret control centers with control panels that they've possibly got access to thousands of people that they're actually controlling and influencing.
Yeah, very possibly.
And you know, we can get into the realms of the unknown, but presumably that research isn't just experimental now, that they're using that kind of satellite technology and control panels with certain people who might have a head full of implants, and they might be a politician.
Oh, yeah,
So, but how far do you think that goes?
Who knows? I mean, you know.
What's your best guess?
Well, you go on YouTube and you'll find images of President Clinton under hypnotic control.
Yeah,
okay,
yeah, I've seen that.
So,
but might he have been implanted?
Could well have been implanted. Like, certainly
well, just all that thought there, Neil. We're going to go for another break because it's getting very interesting. So stay tuned. We'll be back shortly.